the ones that are here in person and the ones that are watching us online. Appreciate you being here. We're going to continue our study this morning on Jacob and his family. And as we got to last Sunday, we got to Joseph and his brothers and what they did and how they sold their own brother, the favorite brother, off into slavery. So now this morning we're going to kind of get close to wrapping it up is the family reconciliation, and we all know this story and what Joseph and his brothers and what ended up happening. So we're going to go through that this morning, kind of jumping for over 3 chapters, but we all know what was going on between chapter 42 and 45, so it's not really that hard to figure out. But before we begin those verses, I'll ask that Andrew if he'd read the Bible Meets Life this morning.
Nelson Mandela, the South African anti-apartheid revolutionary, spent 27 years in prison for his fight against racial segregation and discrimination. During his imprisonment, Mandela endured many hardships and injustices. Yet incredibly, he became the first black president of South Africa in 1994. This unlikely story parallels the life of Joseph. The same government that once jailed him for years saw him rise to the pinnacle of authority in Egypt. We love comeback stories, and Joseph's trials and victories remind us that no matter how far we fall, with God's help we can rise to newer heights and deeper truth of redemption and reconciliation.
So, for most of us in here, we can, or some of you at least can remember Nelson Mandela and what was going on there. He spent 27 years in prison to support his cause and to back his cause, and we all ended up knowing what happened there from prison to the president. So we see how things can happen, not only in Joseph's time that we're talking about in the Bible, but in present day when that happened. So we're going to start the lesson out this morning. It's going to be sort of just starting right on a whim, but just to kind of give you some backdrop of Genesis 42, 3 through 5. So it starts out with verse 3. So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. Don't really tell us much. What's going on here is there's been a famine and there is no food. While we also understand Jacob was a really, really wealthy man and had everything, but as they always say, if you ain't got any food, you can have all the money in the world. If you're starving, it ain't much importance to it. So where we're at here is Jacob is sending. You might notice that he's going to say he sent 10 of Joseph's brothers, and he holds Benjamin back. Well, we all know the story of what happened to Joseph. The 10 brothers came back and said, Joseph's been killed by an animal. So at this point, Jacob doesn't trust his own kids at this time. So he's keeping his one and only son that's left from Rachel back because he don't trust his own sons to be able to take them to Egypt to buy the grain. So that's kind of where we're at. In Joseph's life, we know where Jacob and the sons are at. They're on the way to Egypt. In Joseph's life, we all know that he's been sold into slavery. As preacher E.C. likes to say, God was with Joseph, obviously, because he gets to Egypt. He rises up the ranks. What ends up happening? Potiphar's wife accuses him of trying to come on to her. He gets thrown in jail, stays in jail, meets the cupbearer, and he meets the king's main cupbearer and chief baker, and they get thrown into the same prison with him. They have dreams, and he interprets the dreams, and in this case, he's able to tell them that. They get out of jail. The long and short of this whole deal is God is with Joseph the whole time. He's going through a lot of things in his life, but it seems like every time his faith never falters, his faith never wavers, and he continues on. No matter what happens, he gets sold into slavery. He works his way up. He gets thrown into jail. He meets these people. We talked about that last Sunday. He could have been negative. He could have been all sorts of attitudes that he could have had, but he chose not to. He helped those cupbearers and he helped the chief baker. So when they got back out of jail, guess where they went to? those people went directly to be beside Pharaoh's side. So you got to understand where Joseph is coming here. You need to understand the storylines of where we're starting at. So I'll ask that Laura if she would read verses 42, 3 through 5.
So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he thought, something might happen to him. The sons of Israel were among those who came to buy grain, for the famine was in the land of Canaan.
So it's like I just said, they have no idea that they're heading to Egypt to witness that their brother is now over all of the Pharaoh's affairs in Egypt. He is over all this stuff. He controls it. He's the governor, and he rules everything. But Joseph's brothers is coming to Egypt, and they're leaving Benjamin, as I said earlier, because Jacob does not understand it. But my thoughts on this is we're not even got to that point yet. When they get there to Joseph, could you imagine what his thoughts are? Can you imagine what he's going to feel like and where he's at in his own life? Now, I always thought this was over a shorter period of time, when all this went on, thrown into slavery, into jail. But this period took 20 years. So it's not like he spent a considerable amount of time in jail. So I often think that he threw him in jail and he stayed there like 6 months. No, he stayed in jail years before these things actually came along. So understand that, as he was thrown in jail and everything seemed to be falling down again, there was many times in his life that he could have thrown up his hands and said, God, I don't understand. I don't understand what's going on. We've all had those situations to where it seems like things just keep piling and piling and piling and piling, and you can't understand why I'm doing the things the way you're telling me to do them. But as EC likes to say in the Sunday night Bible study, God was with him, and we'll find out at the end of this lesson how Joseph actually looked at his situation and why he was able to survive the situation the way he did, by looking up at God and saying, hey, this is part of what you got going on in my life, and I understand it. Keep me safe. And as EC likes to say it, you can get around people and be around people, and you hope, and all of us in here hopes, that when people's around us, they see Jesus Christ in us. Well, it was obvious that everywhere Joseph went, Jesus was seen in him, whether it was in jail, whether it was Potiphar, whether it was the Pharaoh. They all seen something in him that was different. And I think that's the call to us to say we need to be a shining light. We need to be a Joseph out in the world, even though things are going wrong. Because a lot of times, I like to say this a lot, it ain't your action, it's your reaction. And a lot of people standing around looking, and I'm sure people were standing around looking at Joseph and going, what's the reaction? But that's why he was different. Hey, this guy was serving Potiphar. He was like high up. He got thrown in jail. How did he react? Well, he took the situation for what it was and made the best of it and understood that there was a reason for it. And in this case, we're going to see that as his brothers start coming to buy the grain. Now, we're going to skip a lot of this situation that I've already talked about. As they're coming there, we're going to read verses 21 through 24. And if Stephen would read that, please.
Then they said to each other, obviously, we are being punished for what we did to our brother. We saw his deep distress when he pleaded with us, but we would not listen. That is why the trouble has come to us. But Reuben replied, didn't I tell you not to harm the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must account for his blood. They did not realize that Joseph understood them, since there was an interpreter between them. He turned away from them and wept.
So what they're talking about here, we obviously skipped from verses 5 all the way to 21. Well, they've come to them and they've bowed down. Now the brothers doesn't understand who Joseph is, but Joseph understands who they are. And this is after Joseph has actually talked rough to him. I don't know what rough meant, but I can only imagine. He was trying to disguise himself so that if there was no way that they would know who he was. So he's been pretty tough on them, and he's accused them of being spies. So they're trying to talk their way out of this thing, because if they're spies, he's got the right to go throw them in jail and leave them there. But Joseph already understands what's going on, and he's already given, I guess you could say, the 10th degree, like they always like to say now, and wondered all these things, but he's trying to set up the storyline of what's going on, because he could have easily thrown him in jail. He could have easily had, I don't even want to even hear, but really what he's doing here is trying to find out what's going on, who they are, and they start talking like this. And can you imagine the amount of despair and guilt that these brothers have had over the last 20 years? Not only do they think their brother's dead, but they actually are the reason why he's dead, because they've not heard from him. You remember, they didn't kill him. They sold him into slavery. So you might see here that they're already kind of questioning each other. Kind of, even Reuben here tries to validate that I told y'all I didn't want to harm Joseph. He's trying to validate his sin, and we all try to do that from time to time as well in our own lives. We try to validate what we did or what we said, and really we don't have anywhere to validate it but just to say we were wrong. But in the event here, we see, and Joseph sees what's going on. He overhears what they're saying. I don't really understand what he's talking about, the interpreter there, because they evidently at this time, it's been so long, there's a language barrier there. But anyway, he turns away and he wept, because he's so emotional that he's been thrown, he's a slave, hadn't seen his brothers in so long, and he hears them having conversations about what they done to him, and that they understand now that they're getting punished for the indiscretion that they had with their brother. Because in these days, when you had disobedience in your life and you ignored a blessing, a lot of times the people believed there was punishment coming. They didn't know when it was coming, but it was coming, and it would be harsh. And this is what they're thinking. This is God's punishment to us for what we did to Joseph. We've come here, and now he's accusing us of being spies. We're probably going to get thrown in jail, and they're going to kill us. So this is where we're at in the whole scheme of things. But as you can see, Joseph obviously does not have the contempt for his brothers that honestly, how could it be hard not to have contempt? We always hear that word karma. Karma, somebody does somebody wrong, or you see something go wrong, or somebody just does wrong by you. And then you say, the first thing you want to say is when something bad happens to them, well, karma, good enough for them. Well, that ain't the way Joseph was trying to look at it. We don't need to look at things that way either. We need to look at life from a general standpoint, that things are going to happen, and we need to face them as Joseph did. Don't look at the negative side all the time. Try to pull a positive out of it. And we're going to see his positive influence and his positive attitude when we jump over to verse 45 in a few minutes, as to what his concept of the whole situation was. It says here, the brothers grappled with each other, and their memories of their sin appeared in snapshots. Joseph's distress, Reuben's unheeded device, and their guilt. We've all been there. We see the power of guilt as it worms into our consciousness. When we're reminded of our own sins, the words we should or shouldn't have said, the past we walked into rebellion, the unjust revenge we relished and now regret. Meanwhile, God patiently waits for us to return to him and confess our sins. So Joseph, as I said, he was with God. He did not ever go through any of these things. You never hear of Joseph saying, I'm going to get revenge on my brothers and throw them in jail. This whole thing that he has got here, he's just trying to validate what his brothers are doing. So trying to remember the whole storyline because it jumps so many places. But as we go forward and move into verse 45, before we get here, Joseph has played this narrative with his brothers. And he's basically told them that you need to go back to your dad. Here's the grain you need. He stuck the money back in all the bags, didn't take any of the money that they had brought to pay for the grain, and sent them all back except for one brother. He held Simon in custody for 3 days while they went back, and he made one point. He said, I'm not going to release your brother until you bring back Benjamin, because they had told him that they were part of Jacob's tribe and that they had 11 brothers and one was killed. And he said, you must bring back Benjamin. So the brothers have gone on their way. They went back, got Benjamin, and came back. And this is where we're at. So we see where Joseph's at in the story. And I'll ask that John, if he would read verses 45, 1 through 5.
Joseph could no longer keep his composure in front of all of his attendants, so he called out, "Send everyone away from me." No one was with him when he revealed his identity to his brothers, but he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and also Pharaoh's household heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But they could not answer him because they were terrified in his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come near me," and they came near. "I am Joseph your brother," he said, "the one you sold into Egypt. And now don't be grieved or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because God has sent me ahead of you to preserve life."
Man, what an attitude to have. Joseph's attitude, first off, he says here in verse 1, he could no longer hold his emotions. When they brought Benjamin back, his one true natural brother with his mother Rachel, he couldn't hold his composure. And so in this situation, he finally has to tell his brothers and pull them in. And can you imagine? It's been 20 years. He's been put in through slavery. He's been to jail. He's been accused of everything. And now he's back on top again, and his brothers are having to come to him for help. And we see what he asked. The first thing he wants to, one of the first things he wants to know is my father still alive? So as we go on into the story, which I'm not going to go all into that, but he's revealing his identity. But you got to understand here, the forgiveness side of what we see with Joseph is kind of in today's time is kind of unreal. He doesn't mention anything about, you sold me into slavery and this and that, and you need to serve your time as I did. Or as we said earlier, he doesn't ask for karma. He doesn't do this or he doesn't do that. He doesn't go after them and tell them to go put them in jail. What does he say? Basically here is he's so emotional he couldn't even answer, just because they were terrified that he was going to kill him. And Joseph was just so emotional because that he had his brothers back in his life. As you see, he says, "I'm Joseph, your brother, the one you sold into Egypt. And now don't be grieved and angry with yourselves for selling me here, because God sent me ahead of you to preserve life." This was Joseph's mentality his whole life. His whole situation, as EC likes to say on Sunday night, was basically geared toward doing what God wanted him to do. And it likes to say in this thing here, and it makes a lot of sense, none of the good we have been possible, none of the good we have in our life most of the time would have been possible without the bad. Joseph's experience reminds us to see the larger picture and acknowledge the author of the story. So this is a very, very, I'm sitting here reading it this morning, but every one of you in here has heard the story of Joseph many, many times. But we also forget Joseph's attitude towards the whole story. And that's what we need to learn from and I like that statement. a lot of the good things in our life don't come without some of the bad. And this, at the end of this situation here, we begin to see none of these things that Joseph went to, it was a stepping stone. Even though I didn't mention it, what did he end up doing? He had the dream that Pharaoh had. I didn't even go through that. Why was he even in the situation he was in? Why was he with Pharaoh? You can see God's work at hand because he could read dreams. God give him that ability. Pharaoh calls Joseph to read dreams. He realizes that there's going to be a 7-year famine, 7-year good and 7-year of bad. That's how Joseph ends up where he's at. So we start to see where there was bad, there came good. Where there was bad again, there came good. And what ended up happening at the end of the story, the brothers come together, and at the end of the day, which gets overlooked a lot of times, Joseph was the main character in this situation that saved Egypt and saved a lot of people in the land of Canaan from famine. Because if he has not been able to interpret that dream and grown and grown and grown and stored the grain that he needed those 7 years to prepare for the 7 bad years, then none of this would have happened. So we can gain a lot from the storyline of the fact that there's bad things going to happen in life, there's good things going to happen in life, and we have to adjust to them. And some of them is going to be a lot worse than others. But if we try to stay on God's path and understand there's a reason behind everything, and I'm sure Joseph, and I'm not saying it's easy because I'm sure Joseph sometimes was like, good Lord, you've thrown me in jail, you've had me sold into slavery. Well, what is the point here? But we begin to see the point over this 20 years of Joseph's life, what God meant and how many people he actually saved and his attitude toward it. Things didn't go very well. He could have, like I said earlier, he could have took the bad ones and kind of put his hands up in the air and said, I quit. But he didn't. He kept plugging along as God told him to. And at the end of the day, those bad things that he went through obviously turned into good, and the good things turned into something that not only saved his life, his family's life, but a lot of people within. And the 13 tribes that they had at that time was formed. So we see a lot of things that God had in his hand in those situations. And I like to say this a lot, if everything was easy and everything was always right and everything was always good, then where would our faith be at? And we see Joseph's faith here that helped the reconciliation of not only his family, but that reconciliation and restoration of Egypt, the land of Canaan, everything that went along with what Joseph did. And we all know there's a whole other story beyond Joseph and his family. So there's a lot of things here that went on. And because of Joseph's attitude and because of Joseph's continuing diligence to try to please God, it led to a lot of good things. And that's kind of the reconciliation story, not only with the brothers, but reconciliation with everything about his life in general. We got 3 things here in the Live It Out section that we can all remember, not only from Joseph's life, but it says here you need to remind yourself. We can all go to any Bible's resource or anything like that and do searches because we got online and stuff everywhere. It says you can choose one passage to write on a sticky note and place it on your mirror as a reminder to always choose forgiveness over bitterness. Yeah, we might get upset over some things at times, and the immediate emotion might carry us away, but we always need to remember at the end of the day, forgiveness is always going to play better in your hand than having bitterness. As Joseph chose the forgiveness, not the bitterness. Even though the many things that he got put through because of his brothers, he chose to do the right thing and chose to follow God and operate in the heart of forgiveness. We've all got stories that we can share. It says we can share a personal experience of our own forgiveness that we forgave somebody for something they may have done to us, a family member or a friend. And then 2, we can initiate that forgiveness. what it's asked just a simple question, and y'all know just as well as I do, what does it take to forgive? It's got to be from the heart. That's no doubt about that. And then ask God to lead you that way. Because we all know in here, forgiveness sometimes ain't easy on both sides. So we understand that. And it's a process. As we see in Joseph's situation, it was a process. It was a situation that was not good, but he turned it into something that was good. And finally down here, the final note it says, Joseph chose the better way, forgiveness. That's why this story has survived for thousands of years as testimony to reconciliation. Joseph's trials and victories remind us that no matter how far we fall, with God's help we can rise to newer heights and deeper truths of redemption and reconciliation. So we learn a lot this morning, as I said in summary, that there's going to be bad times and good times. There's going to be low times and high times. And we can look back to Joseph's life and understand that we need to make the most of both. Learn from the bad, enjoy the good, make sure that keep it on a level playing field, because we don't want a life like living like a roller coaster. So we try to do as Joseph did, take our bad with the good and keep a level mind, a level thought process, so that God can relate to us. Because we all know in times of chaos, it's hard to relate to anybody. It's hard to relate to anything. So we need to remember how Joseph reacted to everything that went on in his life. Let us go to the Lord in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you this morning for this time you've allowed us to come and study your word. We just thank you for Joseph's example, Lord. While you had a plan in his life, sometimes that plan seemed to be all over the place and seemed to be sort of tough and shrewd. But we all know that the bad things in life that we have and the good things all come together in one, Lord, and that is to serve you. Just praying out, Lord, that you'll help us realize that. I pray that you'll be with Pastor E.C. as he brings us a morning message. Help us to hear what he's prepared for us, Lord. We just pray that you'll help us to take it out this week to be true guiding lights of you. I pray all these things in your name. Amen.